Okay, let's get started. So hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Daniel Yudkin. I'm the director of the Beacon Project and a senior advisor at More in Common. I'm really excited to see you all on the call today, and just really excited for our conversation that we're going to have. So we all know that our country is really divided. That's pretty much obvious to anyone who's been paying attention at all to the news recently. And part of what is going to be able to bring us together is recovering common principles, parts of our national story that we all share, that resonate with all Americans. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. I'm super grateful to be joined today by Colin Woodard. Colin is a best-selling author, a historian, and a Pulitzer Prize finalist. He's also the director of the Nationhood Lab at the Pell Center for International Relations and Public Policy at Salve Regina University. And today he's going to be sharing results of a recent study he conducted called The Story of America, a rebooted civic national narrative for the United States. And I came across Colin's work as we at the Beacon Project were working on our own report on a national narrative called Weaving the Dream. And I was really fascinated by the similarities and differences in our respective findings. And I thought it would be really interesting for us to just kind of come together and share our respective research reports and then have a conversation about the implications of these findings for American politics and for the future of our country. And so that's sort of what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be exploring these reports and then having a sort of a broader conversation between the two of us and then opening it up to you all to ask any questions you might have. So just a kind of a roadmap of what we're going to be doing for the next hour. Colin is going to present his research for about 10 minutes. I'll present mine for about 10. We'll spend about 10 minutes asking each other questions and having a sort of a conversation about similarities and differences in our respective findings. And then we're going to open it up to the audience for any questions that you all might have. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Colin. And thanks again, Colin, for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you, Daniel. I'm thrilled that we're able to do this work together and present it together as it's interrelated. And I too find it fascinating the ways that they interlock and sometimes have things that want you to do more research. So
Yeah.
without further ado, yes, I run Nationhood Lab, where I basically study and write about the problems of U.S. nationhood and try to solve them. This morning, I'm here to share findings of that report that Daniel mentioned, which presents a carefully tested story of American purpose. Here, let me share a little slide deck I have for you. Dum. There we go. Um, So it's sharing a developed, renewed national narrative for the United States. So that raises the question, well, what's a national narrative and why at this time of crisis should we care what ours is? And I would argue that in a sense, it's everything, especially at a time when our country is in this kind of crisis and instability. Because nations are, as the late Benedict Anderson put it, imagined communities. They exist only because we collectively believe that they do. And each and every nation is defined and shaped by the stories its members have come to accept about where it came from, what its purpose is, who belongs and who does not. We humans are storytelling species. It's how we make sense of the world. We create and we adapt stories about ourselves all the time, about who each of us thinks that we are, but also what we think about the groups we choose to identify with that make up our identity, the overlapping things. It could be a religion, a sports team, an ethnic group, maybe what we do for work, or the country that a few of our great grandparents came from. Whatever it is, as individuals, we need these stories. We're sort of hardwired for them as facts of our evolutionary biology and the architecture of our psychological wiring as Homo sapiens. And a national story is among the most consequential of all these stories of identity. People need them. And as the Harvard scholar and New Yorker contributor Joe Lepore put it, they can get them from scholars or they can get them from demagogues, but get them they will. So national stories are even more critical for a federated state like Canada or Belgium or the United Kingdom or the former Yugoslavia or the Soviet Union or ourselves, because such nations can't easily fall back on ethnic and religious identities as a crutch. So, like their counterparts in the 1770s or the 1790s or the 1850s, 21st century Americans wonder what holds us together if we still have a shared commitment to, well, I guess just about anything. And it doesn't help that after the Cold War, American leaders stopped talking about national purpose. And as the crises mounted, that allowed demagogues to fill the resulting vacuum, resulting with a narrative that had more authoritarian values and ethno-nationalist definitions of belonging. And here we are, living through the beginning of the consequences of that. Now, if you don't want to live in an authoritarian ethno-state, and polls regularly show that 8 in 10 of us really don't, then what imagined America do you identify with instead? That's the urgent question that we've been working on at Nationhood Lab. Now, fortunately, the United States has the building blocks of a very powerful, credible, inspirational national narrative based on the best version of ourselves. A story built on that most sacred of secular documents from our founding period, the Declaration of Independence. That we're a people defined by our commitment to creating a society where all can be meaningfully and sustainably free. But is that enough? Do Americans still believe in that story? Do most of us still favor it over its ethno nationalist rival, which has its own roots burrowed deep in our history? When our work got underway about 18 months ago, I wasn't at all sure what the answer would be at the outset. But we were in for an unexpected and happy surprise. In our preliminary baseline poll, we asked registered voters across the country which statements about the nature of the United States they most agreed with. We offered competing statement pairs about our national purpose, about American identity, and about the meaning of our past. And in each case, one of these statements was keyed off the ideals in the Declaration. The other rooted in more intrinsic characteristics like ancestry, heritage, character, and values. Now, I actually thought that the latter, the sort of ethno-nationalist adjacent ones, would win out, if only because they felt more solid and maybe real in comparison with the abstract values and propositions you can pull from something like the Declaration. But to my surprise, the civic ones proved far more attractive, regardless of gender, age, race, education, or region. As you can see up here, 63% of Americans preferred the statement that we united, quote, by our shared commitment to a set of American founding ideals, that we all have inherent and equal rights to live, to not be tyrannized, and to pursue our happiness as we each understand it, over one embraced by just 33% of respondents that said we're united instead, quote, by shared history, traditions, and values, and by our fortitude and character as Americans, a people who value hard work, individual responsibility, and national loyalty. And you can see from the crosstabs, the civic vision in green was the overwhelming favorite for almost all the segments, with two major exceptions. Republicans at the bottom there, and those who voted for Trump in 2020. But as you'll see there, still 45% of the respondents of both of those categories also preferred the civic declaration keyed ones, joining 63% of independents and 79% of Democrats. So as a starting point, these were really encouraging numbers, much more so than we expected. We decided to just test straight out, hey, do Americans actually agree with the argument that we are duty bound as Americans to protect one another's natural rights to life and liberty and all the rest? And I thought maybe it'd be a 60-40 split, but no, they do by this incredible 97-2 margin, which is one of the widest our pollsters had ever seen in answer to any question of any sort. I mean, if you ask Americans, and I think Pew did, is the earth round or flat? It's only 80-10 with 10% undecided. So 97-2 is about as universal as you can get, uncannily universal. So after that, we worked to optimize our messaging via additional national polls and batteries of one-on-one qualitative interviews with representative Americans from all walks of life to understand what they thought, to crowdsource, sort of crowdsource material from them to probe at what they believed the ideals, what they thought they meant, and all the rest. And one of our polls, in fact, was done with More in Common's Hidden Tribes respondents, taking advantage of the values-based sort of moral foundations linked theory approach that Daniel himself is an expert on. So thank you, More in Common, for that. That was a great way to triangulate. And in the end, we devised what messaging people call a core narrative frame. Now, you can find it at our website, nationhoodlab.org, which will be dropped into your chat. But I'll read it to you now because it's just one page. Now, it's not meant to be, recited by rote. It's sort of a guiding template from which people can create anything from long-term talking points to television sound bites, internet memes, social media posts, or to inform your own conversations, because the pieces interlock. It goes like this. We're a nation defined not by shared bloodlines, religion, or history, but by a commitment to a set of ideals, the world-changing propositions about the inherent rights of humans set forth in our opening statement as a people, the Declaration of Independence. That every one of us has a set of intrinsic rights given to them by the universe, or God, or as the Declaration puts it, nature's God, to survive, to live safe in their own person, free from domination, to live the life they choose for themselves, and to take part in determining who represents us and in holding them accountable. And that we are, as Americans, in a covenant to defend one another's natural rights to these things. That's the American promise, our mutual pledge to uphold these inalienable rights. And the American experiment is the effort, despite the despotic track record of human history, to build a nation, a society, a world where that is possible. We're a people united by our commitment to uphold and defend this experiment, lest it perish from the earth. These are the ideals Frederick Douglass fought for in every speech he gave. This is Lincoln at Gettysburg and Martin Luther King Jr. on the Mall. They're ideals we've spent 250 years struggling to achieve, ideals contested from the outset by those who would make our country something far less, just another nation state built on blood, tribal kinship, inherited rule, inherited slavery, or inherited servitude, where rights are things granted by superiors when they are granted at all. Americans fought a civil war over them at home and a world war for them abroad, and advanced them at Seneca Falls, Selma, and Stonewall. They're ideals each generation must fight for, and that we fight for today. We reckon with our shortcomings, take pride in our advances, and pledge ourselves to make the Union more perfect. And that's it. So thank you, and over to Daniel.
Thank you, Colin. Well, I like yeah, there is certainly a power to those words. I certainly feel it when you're reading them out. There's something deep about the way that those words resonate. So,
Yeah,
um
it's this, secular scripture, as it were, of the civic creed and the most powerful elements of it, which is why we'll get to this in a second, but which is why I thought that a lot of these anachronistic things would be unpacked and made more like real, like talk like an ordinary person. But when we were message testing, we discovered they have such a power that many of them people didn't want them unpacked. And it didn't shift by education and stuff because they mean something almost like quoting biblical scripture. They have a power of their own. So.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Really cool. Well, I will share our report, and then I look forward to thinking through with you what are some of the areas of convergence there. So I'll go ahead and share here. Okay, so I'm going to be sharing the results today of some findings from the Beacon Project's first report that is called Weaving the Dream: How Opportunity and Personal Agency Can Shape Common Vision for America. And first, let me just share a word about the Beacon Project. The Beacon Project is a multi-year initiative at More in Common. And More in Common is an international nonpartisan nonprofit research organization seeking to identify a new civic vision that can speak to modern challenges. We use insights from psychology, philosophy, data science, and political science to identify narratives that can reawaken Americans' sense of common purpose and shared fate. And our work is reflected really nicely in this quote by David Brooks that I came across a few months ago. He wrote, "We need a national narrative that points us to some ideal and gives us each a noble role in pursuing it. That's the gigantic cultural task that lies ahead. And there's some really interesting echoes, Colin, I think, with this idea of being duty bound to protect each other's rights and this idea of
Mhm.
a noble goal. Um, so to situate the work that I want to be talk about today, I want to take you all back to the year 2018, when More in Common published a study called Hidden Tribes. In that study, we used a statistical technique called hierarchical clustering and found that America is divided into 7 different what we call tribes, which range from progressive activists on the far left, which comprise about 8% of the population, to devoted conservatives, representing about 6% of the population on the far right of the ideological spectrum. And each tribe is defined by their particular core beliefs or ways of seeing the world. And these range from their moral values, their beliefs about personal agency and responsibility, their sense of threat, and their group identity. Now, in follow-up work, we wanted to know which core belief best predicts which tribe someone will be assigned to or belong to. So we ran a series of regression analyses, which basically allows you to see among all these different variables on the left, age, race, party importance, gender, the importance of care, nationality, authoritarianism, purity, authority, activism, all of these variables, which is most helpful for determining which tribe someone is going to be assigned to. We found that the most important variable is something called agency beliefs. Now, what is agency? We define agency as the belief that one's choices and actions can change their life and circumstances. And in our research, we measured it with 3 questions. First, which statement do you agree with more? People are largely responsible for their own outcomes in life versus people's outcomes in life are determined largely by forces outside of their control. 2, which of the following played a greater role in getting you where you are today? Hard work and effort versus luck and circumstance? Or 3, how much control do you feel most people have over the way their life turns out? A, some people's situations are so challenging that no amount of work will allow them to find success. And B, people who work hard can find success no matter what situation they were born into. Now, in psychology, which is the field that I come from, we know that agency beliefs are central to how people understand themselves. So, for example, research by Albert Bandura showed that feelings of agency, or what he called self-efficacy, are associated with increased engagement, persistence, and ultimately performance in academic contexts. So, in other words, believing that you can succeed, that you have agency, that you have the ability to succeed in a particular context is correlated with your likelihood of actually succeeding through persistence and perseverance. On the other side of the coin, research by Martin Seligman and his colleagues showed that losing a sense of agency can result in what he calls learned helplessness, where people feel unable to escape a negative situation. This is common for people experiencing things like depression. So, agency is a powerful determinant of people's outcomes in life. Now, agency is also a cornerstone of American history. Events ranging as far as the American Revolution to the moon landing to the civil rights movement all reflect moments in which people overcame massive obstacles through determination and grit and perseverance and force of will. And founding fathers such as John Adams linked agency with the core American principle of freedom or liberty. He wrote, "Liberty is a self-determining power in an intellectual agent. It implies thought and choice and power." And so we wanted to explore how Americans think about agency in their own lives. To do this, we use a large data set that was collected by More in Common over the course of 8 years, ranging from 2017 to 2025. We also used data collected from the World Values Survey, which surveyed a large number of adults in a long longitudinal series of data collection efforts from 1995 to 2022. And we also used an international data set, which consisted of samples collected from the United Kingdom, France, and Germany. So the total sample size here was around 60,000 individuals. So here's what we found. The first sort of top line finding here is that most Americans place a great amount of importance on this idea of hard work and personal agency. So, for example, three-quarters say that hard work and effort played a greater role than luck and circumstance in getting them where they are today. And about two-thirds say that people are primarily responsible for their own outcomes in life. Um, this is a belief that transcends demographic groups. So here I'm showing you the percent of people who said that hard work played a greater role than luck and circumstance in getting them where they are today. And it's broken down by demographic group. So you can see here that overall, again, 75% of Americans agree that hard work and effort played a larger role. But this is also the case among Republicans, independents, and Democrats. A majority, large majorities of each party said this. Majority of um, white, Hispanic, Black, and Asian Americans also agreed with this statement. And notably, if we go down here, we see that immigrant Americans, American immigrants, are more likely to embrace this idea of the importance of hard work and effort than Americans who were born here. So this is not a question about race or politics. This is something that really transcends all these demographic categories. We also find that Americans across the aisle agree that the individual is the greatest contributor to success. So, for example, we asked our sample, how important is each of the following in contributing to an individual's success? And we asked them for the individual, for the family, for community, and government. And we see that overwhelmingly across all political affiliations, people say that the individual is the most important contributor to success, with over 90% agreement, followed by the family, community, and government. And so the upshot here is that Americans hold this abiding faith in the power of individuals to transcend negative circumstances and exhibit personal agency. Now, one thing you might be asking is whether this is a uniquely American phenomenon. Is this something that's really just uh, true of our country, but less true elsewhere? And in fact, actually, the answer is no. So we compared the rates of agreement to the statement that people are largely responsible for their own outcomes in life across France, United States, Germany, and the UK. And America is not particularly higher or lower than any of these other comparison states. However, what does set Americans apart is the degree to which this issue is politicized. So here I'm showing you the percent of people who said that hard work matters more than luck in shaping people's lives. And this is broken down by country, as well as whether people identify as politically left or right. And the largest gap here is for the United States, suggesting this issue is more polarized here than it is abroad. Now, you might be wondering, how could this issue be simultaneously a feature that unites Americans and also polarizes them? And this is exactly the question we were asking when we came across this data, because I just finished telling you that Americans are broadly united about the power of agency, and yet here we see that this is a kind of a polarizing issue. So to understand the dynamics here, you have to dig a little bit deeper into the data. And one sort of revealing analysis that you can do is to see how these beliefs have evolved over the past 30 years. So here what I'm showing you is a graph of changes in Republicans and Democrats' views about whether people or the government should take more responsibility. So here on the top of the graph, you see people should take more responsibility to provide for themselves. And on the bottom here, it's government should take more responsibility to ensure that everyone is provided for. You can see that in the late 90s, Democrats and Republicans held fairly similar views. Their views diverged by about a single point on this 10-point scale. Since then, that divergence has tripled. And so essentially what we're seeing is that while this issue used to be an area that really united people, it's become a little bit more polarized than it used to be. Another thing that we did is explore what happens when you break out people's responses by their hidden tribe. So here, the gray bars indicate whether people are more likely to believe that outcomes are typically outside of people's control. And then the purple bars indicate how the agreement with the idea that people are responsible for their own outcomes. And it's broken down by the hidden tribe analysis that I talked about earlier. And what you can see is that this one group really stands out, which is the progressive activists. This is a most politically liberal group, and they are uniquely likely to reject the idea that people are responsible for their own outcomes in life. Only 13% of progressive activists embrace this view, which is about one-fifth of the national average. So this group is driving much of the polarization on this issue. Now, even though they're driving polarization, it's important to acknowledge that from the perspective of social science research, progressive activists actually have a point. So, growing evidence from economics, from sociology, and other disciplines shows just how much people's chances of success depend on factors that are truly outside of their control. So, for example, each of these graphs here shows evidence of declining social mobility and increasing wealth inequality in the United States. And American history, of course, is full of examples of people being denied the opportunity to exercise agency, from the legacy of slavery to Jim Crow to hiring discrimination more recently. And so the challenge here is to try to find a way to tell a story that acknowledges these barriers to people exercising agency without rejecting the power and the importance that many Americans place in these concepts. So to answer this question, we held hundreds of conversations with ordinary Americans across all 50 states. And we asked them, how much do you think that hard work and effort matter for determining life versus luck and circumstance? And in people's responses, in the way that they talk and think about these issues, really interesting nuances emerged. So, for example, here's a quote from a 63-year-old Republican man from Mississippi. He said, to an extent, outside forces do contribute to life outcomes. However, hard work and perseverance can overcome many obstacles. It's true, we do not pick what circumstances we're born into, and the circumstances are different for everyone. However, we are responsible for the choices we make and the consequences of those decisions. And this quote is actually remarkably similar to a statement made by none other than Martin Luther King in the 1950s. He said, we're not responsible for the environment we were born in. Neither are we responsible for our hereditary circumstances. But there is a third factor for which we are responsible, namely the personal response which we make to these circumstances. And so, based on these conversations, we constructed a series of statements that asked Americans to choose between one sided perspectives on agency or those that combine both of these perspectives. And what we find is that Americans overwhelmingly prefer what we call blended statements. So, for example, they're much more likely to endorse a statement that people should take responsibility for their own lives and that the government should ensure that everyone has a fair shot at 71%, than a statement that says people need to take responsibility for their own lives, but the government should stay out of the way. Or we should stop emphasizing personal responsibility and instead focus on the government ensuring everyone has a fair shot. So we call this idea both and politics and suggest that it might be an important key to a healthy civic narrative for the future. But the most popular statement concerned something that we call morally directed agency. And I'm really interested to explore, Colin, with this idea of duty that you saw in your own research. The idea here is that people should have an opportunity to exercise agency, but also use this agency to give back to their communities. And so here's the statement that we found that really gains a lot of agreement. America should be built on a deal of rights and responsibilities. The country should guarantee its citizens what they need to live up to their full potential: education, opportunity, and dignity. People, in turn, have a responsibility to use that potential to improve themselves and give back to their country and community. So we think this is a promising direction for future work on our national narrative, and I'm interested in thinking about how it might interface with some of the statements that you identified, Colin. So just to kind of sum up here, takeaways are that Americans really hold a strong commitment to the power of personal agency, but they don't see agency and opportunity as mutually exclusive. Instead, they believe that people should be given an opportunity to exercise their own agency and also endorse this idea of morally directed agency, in which people use their opportunities and their power in service of the common good. Um, efforts to rebuild a civic narrative should build on rather than downplay the power of personal agency. Okay, so that's my end of things. And now I wanted to kind of turn it over to a broader conversation, Colin, with you about how we can think about these respective statements and what to make of them. So I think I'll end my presentation now. Great. And I think that maybe what I'll do is I'll maybe start by asking you a question, and we can kind of talk, and then maybe turn it over to the audience for Q&A.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious, you know, one thing that our research is kind of identifying is this idea that Americans feel that feel that agency or hard work can be leveraged as sort of a form of service or an opportunity to give back to one's community. And I'm just wondering how you think that that idea, either converges or diverges with some of the findings that you showed in your research.
Yeah, it converges. So, the kind of questions you're asking, I think, are really important and essential ones. They're ones that I was working on sort of 2015, 2016 in parallel from a sort of historian's perspective. I'll stick this into the chat, but in 2016, I did a book that was arguing that the big struggle in the United States has always been, how do you execute the American experiment? Do you do it by emphasizing individual liberty or the building of a free community? In other words, do you believe that everyone has agency? If government, everybody left you alone, you could get to it, that you're responsible for yourself and can build, the world you want to build and have a more dynamic society? Or do you believe that we can only be free and realize our potential through the infrastructure that civilization has built over 5,000 years to make it possible for anyone to think that individuals could be universally free in a society, that you have to invest in all those shared communitarian resources and public goods. You need to tax people so you have schools and roads and clinics and hospitals so that regardless of the circumstance of your birth, you have that shot. And it's a
Hmm.
spectrum, right? Individual liberty, individualism, common good, communitarianism. You need them both. I was in Eastern Europe just before communism collapsed as an exchange student and spent, my 20s covering that region. And that was a region where individuals had, no rights and freedoms. And it was absolutely terrible, right? You need to have balance between those things. They need to be in equilibrium. But where does the balance lie? And a lot of countries are more easily able to figure that out. The United States is a federation of very different regional cultures that have totally different, dating back to the colonial period, totally different stances on individual agency versus, that like you need society, like the Puritans would believe that, they're there, God chose them as a covenanted people to do great things in the world, and that the community as a whole has to execute the mission. The individual's liberty isn't as important as the community's effort. Whereas if you're out in, say, the Appalachian frontier, protect your kith and kin, build it yourself. Don't rely on government because they'll all try to exploit you. So there's very strong varying traditions. And you're capturing this in what you're seeing. So as I look at it, like the top tier national narrative work we've been doing now is because of the crisis over, are we actually committed to being a free society in the end? The natural rights commitment in the Declaration. As soon as you say yes, and 70 to 80% of Americans actually do say yes, then the next tier down question is, okay, how do you do that? And this that you're talking about now is the answer to that one step down question of, okay, how do we execute the promise of the Declaration? And that is like the fundamental federal level legitimate political fight that we've had in our history about how do you execute it. And I just find it, it gives me chills sometimes looking at your data about agency and stuff and how much that maps up with what I do, not from a a psychologist perspective, but as sort of like a historian digging into, the political philosophy, the battle over the ideas, they match up very closely. If you want my own take, which is an American character, you have to have the two things in equilibrium, and the country has fallen into crisis, which led to our democratic collapse and the Declaration being questioned at all, because we kept veering for 2 generations further and further into the individual liberty element. We lost the balance, and when you lose the balance, people don't get more free. It becomes almost impossible, based on circumstance of your birth, to rise up. Opportunity falls apart. Some of the graphs you showed, there's a little county level one from Raj Chetty about the county level, like what's your chance of, if you're born in the, last quintile, of getting to the top. It's regionally varied, and it's regionally varied almost perfectly at the county level based on old settlement patterns between the individualistic colonial cultures and the communitarian ones, because the latter doesn't invest to the same degree in stuff. And the results, which we've seen in Nationhood Labs work on, the data on current public health, obesity, disability, gun violence, life expectancy, FICO credit scores, happiness, self-reported, the division that we see over and over again on a regional level in the United States tracks almost perfectly that the places that have emphasized individual liberty do badly in every single way. So my argument would be we need to restore the balance, and the balance is somewhere lying, the 1950s that are looked on as a golden age was a time when we were investing in all kinds of public goods and stuff. Tax rates were higher, and we were building interstates and public universities and, all of the rest. And that was a time where you had fairly broad-based um, opportunity. So I think that's, broadly speaking, that's where I think the balance point lies. It sounds like from your data that people also agree with that, right? Individual agency is so important to the American character, the belief that we're supposed to be a free and dynamic society, not a social democracy. The equilibrium point, if you shift into social democracy beyond sort of New Dealish stuff, no, people don't want the government deciding those things. People want to make sure that there's a playing field out there. May the best person or idea or product win, but it has to be a fair playing field, and the refs have to go take out the cheaters. And that's the balance point. That's like the American dream zone that matches up with the data that you just showed, and in the way that gave me tingles when I was like, oh my gosh, there it is.
Yeah, yeah. No, I love that. I love, you're right. And for those in the audience who haven't had a chance to read Colin's book, American Character, I highly recommend it. It's just such a fantastic analysis of exactly some of these questions. So I was really inspired by that book, actually,
Oh, thank you.
in this line of thinking. And as a psychologist, I always find it really interesting to think about the ways in which individual sort of phenomena and challenges that we grapple with as individuals can also manifest at the community level and at the national level. As individuals, we're also grappling with questions of how much my own life is the result of forces outside of my control versus how much I can exert agency to make decisions or surmount negative circumstances. And I think that those questions that we ask for ourselves are also then get reflected into our views about what makes for a healthy civic culture and what types of policy should be implemented to create a healthy country. So I've always been fascinated in that sort of interplay between the application of the individual inferences that we make about ourselves and our own lives and the people around us, and then how those get transmuted and reflected into the broader political sphere.
Exactly, which draw, anthropology and sociology and stuff, the cultural transmission and the effect it has on us as individuals, as you're, the unexamined assumptions that you're more likely to have in a community where the dominant, idea is this as opposed to that, is going to, affect the distribution of people with this or that predilection, right?
Yeah.
Not completely, but it has a noticeable population level effect, which in turn results in different political choices being made and different policies being implemented that act as reinforcing mechanisms that could let you have that upward mobility map you saw there. We see a similar county map in everything from, obesity to life expectancy. Here, I'm going to shut up this dog, but I'll be right back.
Okay. Good. Well, I see a number of questions here on the Q&A. Let's see. I'm not sure if so let's start at the top here. Using the lens of individual agency seems culturally skewed to me. The African concept of Ubuntu is an alternative that I feel is more grounded in reality. Saying believing everything depends on atomistic individuals simply isn't true. Without community, individuals can't exercise agency. So why use that lens to investigate core beliefs? Yeah, I think that this is a question that if I may sort of uh, push back a little bit, I think that what at least the effort that we're trying to grapple with in our research is where is that balance and how do we reconcile Americans' belief in individual self-determination with many of the insights that we gain from social science, which highlight all of the ways in which people's lives are in fact determined by structural and historic and external sources. So I think that that really does, in fact, that comment really kind of reflects the challenges that we're grappling with here. Um,
I would briefly say also, I mean, that's absolutely true as a human experience, but because the American mythos and creed, perhaps entirely wrongly, is built on this Enlightenment notion of atomistic individuals, yeah, it may be false, but because culturally that's built into the mechanisms and the way we're told to look at the world, it becomes one of the most relevant ways to ask about Americans' values because we live in this soup, whether it's right or wrong.
yeah, thank you for that. Let's go to Rachel. Can you give a few specific cultural institutional examples where you see elite discourse undermining or neglecting agency? Individual example, you see elite discourse undermining or neglecting agency. So I think that my quick response to this is that I think that politicians and leaders are all grappling with how to we in, in advance justice and acknowledge the ways in which people's lives are often determined by external forces without undermining agency. And this is really the core not to be untied. How can we simultaneously acknowledge both of those? Because I do think that people who are trying to create a fairer society often emphasize the sort of the external forces element of this, um, and it can be often construed and maybe to the sort of strategically, given that Americans care so much about agency, it can be to politicians' detriment if they only emphasize one side of that story without emphasizing the agency part of it. And so I think there might be strategic implications for the way that politicians who are trying to advance a fair society talk about these issues that can resonate with Americans in a way that doesn't feel as though it's undermining this deeply held creed that Americans hold about the importance of individual self-determination. Um, I want to make sure that Colin, let's get a question for you. So, if you want to look through the Q&A here,
Sure. Well, I can
why don't
also key in just for a moment
yeah,
on the agency question. I mean, you're always going to run up against the fact that there's this deep American creed or mythos that, if we're to be free and pursue our happiness and are free to do that, that therefore that assumes agency, and that the whole creed is about if we're free, good things will happen, we'll be prosperous, and that's the way society is supposed to function. So you can't, if you're denying the possibility that people can do that, you're running up against all the currents of the sort of American ideology. And it would be very hard to change that. It's been around for quite a bit. You have to work with it. You got to protect it from its excesses, which are myriad. But I would say if you want to look at excesses in the other direction, they're rarer because of the American bias in that direction. I mean, even our more communitarian culture, it's like, the legacy of Puritan New England, the Puritans in New England were like, Max Weber's, Protestant work ethic people. They're not exactly, communistic in their approach. But one example would be like in the era where, great society and the belief that the best and brightest minds, the technocrats in Washington, could solve any problem, right? You could have a war on poverty where it was literally done with the federal government coming in, knocking down your blighted neighborhood and building these wonderful concrete towers that we've decided will make for a better society, right? No reference to the individuals and the communities at all. It was sort of a top-down technocratic approach, sort of denying agency. If we create the correct environment that we see on paper, everything will turn out great. It didn't. Same with the World Bank in the same time period, going and saying, what this country needs to develop is X, Y, and Z that we came up back at home, and we're just going to deploy that on you, and then therefore your society will be better, and causing all kinds of crazy, horrible, unexpected results because you didn't look at individuals, agency, culture, what people might do. It was kind of way skewed over to the side of we create the correct system as we understand it, maybe not even consulting the people on the ground first in any way, just deploy it, and that sort of hubris has turned out very bad. But they're less common than the hubris on the individualistic side in the American context because of the cultural and ideological soup that we've lived in since the 1770s.
Yeah, thank you for that. Colin, would you like to scan the questions and see if there's one that speaks to you? Maybe let's do
Uh,
Joy Mayer's. Given Colin's background, I'll read it out loud.
okay.
And given Colin's background, I wonder what advice he'd have for journalists covering a divided country. Is there potential for them to weave reminders of what people agree on into coverage, or to cover this issue of equilibrium between personal liberty and community responsibility more thoughtfully?
Yeah, I mean, I think the latter definitely. I think you also one mistake that journalism has been making is that I was had an entire career in journalism, working in newsrooms and the like, and the function of journalism in a liberal democracy, small l, small d, is to act as accountability to power and provide truth and information that if we're to be a society where the people are sovereign, the people need the information to make wise decisions, and journalism is supposed to try to provide those things. And that sense of sort of truth telling and accountability of those in power who run us, and being a watchdog on those things has kind of been lost. There was a biggest mistake, I think, is to try to always be neutral, not to try to tell the truth of what's going on, but to try to position you in such a way that the two sides of whatever issue, that you're always just going to try to stand on the 50-yard line and everything. And
Right.
that's incredibly destructive to the fundamental mission of journalism and thus to democracy itself. So you don't want to do that. But the whole argument over individual liberty and personal responsibility and communitarian values, it's a fantastic one. There's a balance point out there. There's data that can help show what works and what doesn't. It's not just who will ever know. There sometimes you can find answers, and they can surprise you sometimes. So it's doing that. Be a little bit like a scientist. You got a research question in front of you today. You got to turn in the story in 8 hours, but the research question, hey, the hypothesis is X. Is that true or not? See how far you can go and run with it if your editors will let you.
I'm going to keep going down the list here. We know that language plays an important part of shaping our relationships and culture. It sounds like both studies are heavily focused on English speakers. Do you think these findings would hold in other languages, thinking of immigrant communities who may not speak English? Thanks for the question. So I can only I'll take it, and then Colin, if you have anything you want to add, I could obviously only speak to what our research has shown. And there were several sort of notable responses to this. One thing that I mentioned in the talk is the fact that immigrant communities, people who immigrated to America, are more likely to believe in these notions of the American dream and personal agency and the power of hard work than people who were born here. We obviously don't know whether these are English language speakers or not. I assume that some of them came from countries that don't speak English. So to that extent, that's an answer to your question. And then, of course, we also, in the international comparison, find that this is not a uniquely American phenomenon. There's a human need to believe in our ability to have control over the world around us, to have agency, to be able to make decisions that impact the course of our lives. And in fact, some of the psychological research that I showed suggests that when people don't have that belief, it actually leads to a lot of negative consequences. And then feelings of agency are correlated with a sense of well-being, a sense of purpose in life, and a lot of positive outcomes. So there's a real tangle here because we can acknowledge, and I think that Colin is absolutely right in saying that there's the pendulum here is trying to find the right balance. And it seems right now, and the evidence that Colin has shown in the various different communities across the nations in America shows that these highly individualistic cultures tilt very too far and they don't have as much social mobility. But there is a sort of middle ground, but it's a very common, uniquely human experience that transcends the American context, and in fact actually is just as true in some what you might call more socialistic democracies like in Western Europe as it is here in America. People, this is a uniquely human belief to believe in the power of our efforts and agency. So Colin, I don't know if you want to add anything there.
Yeah, I mean, we also, it would be wonderful to know that in enormous detail. We're limited by funding like everything. So our surveys themselves were in English. If somebody actually couldn't respond to a poll not in English, they would be excluded from the data set, unfortunately. I would love to know, especially Spanish speakers only in certain regions, would there be any divergence and the like? So I don't have the data, but I would say that broadly speaking, within the limitation of language, immigrants would be, captured in, sort of their in proportion to their presence in these national surveys that we're putting together, and also that we know from social science, broadly speaking, immigrants to the United States are self-selecting on the individualistic side of things. If you come from a much more communitarian culture where individualism is not emphasized, if you're leaving and coming to the United States to start over and going through all of that effort, it's often because you're from a sort of individualistic minority or coming in. So most of the immigrant communities will probably be more on that side about personal agency than people who did not emigrate at the same time. Would it be different for a refugee community because of war? Absolutely. But again, you need a lot of data in that. We know people in other societies feel very differently about agency and how much control you have over your own destiny. Not so much as in Western Europe, but if you were to go to other countries where you know the idea that the world can be transformed through you in real time is not really front and center in the worldview the way it is in the United States.
Yeah. Let's move to the next question from Martin. I'm gonna this is quite long, and in the interest of time, I'm just gonna skip to the very last question here. I support the effort, but how can we best get both and thinking to take root in a polarized two-party system? I think, Colin, you didn't label it as such, but I think that your statement really reflects this dualistic sort of rights and responsibilities, our duties to protect each other's rights. So I wonder if you have any can sort of speak to this idea of how to get this type of thinking more front and center in popular thinking.
Yeah, that's why stepping it up to that national narrative, it's like whether you're arguing from the individualistic or communitarian point of view, what does everyone have in common? What are you arguing about? What are we trying to achieve that you're having an argument about how to achieve? And that's why that stuff in the Declaration is so important, and why the part which is implied in the way the Declaration is constructed, the part about a covenant, as it were, that we are actually obliged to protect one another's rights to these things. They've pledged themselves to this declaration at the end, the people who signed it, but it's built into the logic of the whole thing. That's a really important point. Without that, if we're atomistically as individuals just pursuing our own freedom, even if it tramples on one another, the whole thing can't possibly work. And just recognizing that, the fact that that came out 97 to 2 was really encouraging to me. We did stress test that, like, in real world situations, do people, the same respondents, actually support it by the same measures if they feel like their tribe is being affected by the violation of the natural rights promises? Well, not necessarily, but in principle, people really do believe in that, and you can work with it. And that is something that transcends parties. There's probably a majority of Republicans and supermajority of Democrats and a probably supermajority of independents would all be on board with that statement. And that in this polarized time is pretty amazing. So it has the potential to build across those differences that we need to build from that. The fact that you could get everyone in the same room with the same guardrails to have a conversation. Okay, our task is to execute the promise in the Declaration. Go, right? That we have this. Should we support this bill or not? Well, does it further or harm the promise in the Declaration? That's a fairly constructive way to frame the conversation, which is not what's happening now. You know, will it work? No, but will it increase the possibility of something constructive happening? Absolutely. And you can refer back. If each politician has to say, I'm supporting this because it furthers it, then that's helpful. Explain to us how it furthers it. So that's
Yeah.
kind of the idea. It's kind of the North Star that can kind of guide and kind of bring us all so that we're at least, fighting over the same question rather than yelling at each other from different corners in completely different world frames.
Yeah, it's great because it seems obvious, like, oh yeah, yeah, the Declaration of
Right.
Independence. But actually, it provides a really helpful frame, and as I think it was right when you said it helps you ask the right questions, right? Which is
Yeah.
exactly what we want to be
And what
doing.
does the Declaration really mean? I mean, stop and think about it for a second. What are the implications of it? Yeah, we haven't fulfilled it, but what was the battle for it? What does it mean if you don't support those values? Where do you end up going? And we fit those all into that core narrative frame that we tested. It kind of answers all those questions. What's the American promise? What's the American experiment? They're all kind of defined, so you can then, with a common definition, make use of those things.
Yeah. Okay. Last question. We have the research, we have the data. What are the best ways you've seen to help someone go from I care to I'm in? Um, well, in the end, so very short answer here with an understanding that we're at limited time. I will just tease that the Beacon Project is working on some projects that are going to be forthcoming in the coming months to think about ways to and so if you're interested, you're welcome to please encourage you to check out our website, thebeaconproject.us. And yeah, and that's it for me. Colin, is there anything you'd like to say before we close?
No, I just thank you for this conversation. I'm so glad to be able to connect on these things, and I look forward to seeing how our research overlaps and informs one another going forward. And thanks to all of you for coming and hearing us out.
Yeah, I want to just second that. It was really fun speaking with you, Colin, and just so I feel like I learned a lot and also just found a lot of really interesting resonances and also really appreciated the thoughtful questions from the audience. So thank you all so much. And with that, I think we'll close it out.
Thanks all.